It's been a busy past week. I was at camp, and it's good to be back. Melanie and my family, they are in Downing celebrating. My father-in-law is retiring from preaching today, and so all of my family is down there with him. But as I was driving home from camp, I heard on the news that Roe versus Wade was overturned by the Supreme Court. It's a historic decision, and it will have far-reaching ramifications, just like the first decision did clear back in 1972. I have to admit that a part of me wanted to just ignore it, as talking about politics has gotten me into some trouble here in the past. But I finally decided that as a minister, I have a responsibility to address how Christians are called to live in the world that we find ourselves in. The decision the Supreme Court made on Friday does not make abortion illegal. It simply sends the decision of abortion back to the states to decide. Some states will limit or outlaw abortions, and other states won't. To be clear, I am solidly pro-life. I believe that all life is special, and that God loves those with Down syndrome just as he loves you and me. Also, I think it's important to realize that none of us has absolute control over our bodies. It's illegal to use illicit drugs, not to wear a seatbelt, or to drive while drunk. I find it interesting that people that are chanting, "My body, my choice," in regard to abortion, but that many of those same people don't feel the same way about things like COVID-19 vaccinations. What I want to look at this morning is how should Christians live and respond to government in regard to policies, laws, and political correctness in the nation that we live in. So what I want to look at this morning applies whether you agree with those people who are currently in government positions or whether you don't agree. How you're going to respond, I think, is going to be the same either way. Turn with me to Matthew chapter 22, verses 17 through 21. I'm going to read from the New Century Version. And the religious leaders were trying to trap Jesus. And so they asked him one of those questions, are you still beating your wife kind of thing? You're doomed if you do, doomed if you don't. Yes, if you say yes, you're still beating your wife, well, shame on you. And if you say no, well, you were beating your wife and shame on you. It's kind of one of those deals. And it says this, "So tell us what you think. Is it right to pay taxes to Caesar or not?" But knowing that these leaders were trying to trick him, Jesus said, "You hypocrites, why are you trying to trap me? Show me a coin used for paying the tax." So the men showed him a coin. Then Jesus asked, "Whose image and name are on the coin?" The men answered, "Caesar's." Then Jesus said to them, "Give to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and give to God the things that are God's." Taxes in Jesus' day were about as popular as taxes are today. Nobody wants to pay them. And so the trap there, I think, was if Jesus said, "Pay your taxes," well, that would be hugely unpopular to the crowds. But then if Jesus said, "Don't pay your taxes," well, the next visit that these religious leaders would have made would have been straight to Pontius Pilate. This morning, I'd like to look at three things that we need to do as Christians in regard to our government. And the first is this: obey the government if it doesn't violate God's law. As Christians, we are called to obey the government if it doesn't violate God's law. In 1 Peter 2, 13 through 17, reading from the New Living Translation, it says this: "For the Lord's sake, accept all authority. The king is head of state, and the officials he has appointed. For the king has sent them to punish all who do wrong, and to honor those who do right, It is God's will that your good lives should silence those who make foolish accusations against you. You are not slaves, you are free. But your freedom is not an excuse to do evil. You are free to live as God's slaves, show respect for everyone, love your Christian brothers and sisters, fear God, and show respect for the king. There we are instructed to obey our government. And God intends for us to do that as long as it doesn't violate God's law. The Bible goes so far as to say that God has allowed our government officials to be in power and that they will one day answer to Him for the job that they have done. We may not agree with all of their policies and practices, but we're supposed to honor them and pray for them as they lead our country. Paul also says much the same thing as Peter did in Romans. In Romans 13, verses 1 through 7, it says this, and this comes from the New Century Version. All of you must yield to the government rulers. No one rules unless God has given him the power to rule, and no one rules now without that power from God. So those who are against the government are really against what God has commanded. And they will be punished, they will bring punishment, rather, on themselves. Those who do right do not have to fear the rulers, only those who do wrong fear them. Do you want to be unafraid of the rulers? Then do what is right, and they will praise you. The ruler is God's servant to help you. But if you do wrong, then be afraid. He has the power to punish. He is God's servant to punish those who do wrong. So you must yield to the government, not only because you might be punished, but because you know that it is right. This is also why you pay taxes. Rulers are working for God and give their time to their work. Pay everyone then what you owe. If you owe any kind of tax, pay it. Show respect and honor to them all. Sometimes that's easier said than done, isn't it? But we are called to obey our government as long as it doesn't contradict what God tells us to do in His Word. Within our government framework, we have the right to disagree and even peaceably protest policies and laws that we believe are ungodly or unjust, but not to react in the way that we saw in the George Floyd riots. There is no way that God was glorified in the burning and the destruction of property that we saw in the news and on TV, or in the deaths that resulted from those riots. That would also be true if we see violence over the reversal of Roe versus Wade. God expects His people to honor and respect those who have been placed over us, even if we don't personally agree with them. Second, as Christians, when the laws conflict with God's law, we must obey God rather than men. When the government's laws or regulations conflict with God's law, we must obey God rather than men. In Luke 6:46, Jesus says, "Why do you call me Lord, Lord, but do not do what I say?" Jesus either is Lord of your life or He isn't. If He is Lord, you'll do the things that He tells you to do and asks for you to do. If He isn't, then you'll do what you want. When the laws or rules of the land conflict with God's law, we must obey God rather than man. We can find an example of this very thing in Daniel chapter 3. The nation of Judah had been taken into captivity, and some of the Hebrews had to choose whether to follow God's law or King Nebuchadnezzar's. Let's look quickly at Daniel 3, verses 12 through 18. Reading this morning from the New International Version, it says, "But there are some Jews whom you have set over the affairs of the provinces of Babylon, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who pay no attention to you, O king. They neither serve your gods nor worship the image of gold that you have set up." Furious with rage, Nebuchadnezzar summoned Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. So these men were brought before the king. And Nebuchadnezzar said to them, "Is it true, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you do not serve my gods or worship the image of gold that I have set up? Now when you hear the sound of the horn, flute, zither, lyre, harp, pipes, and all kinds of music, if you are ready to fall down and worship the image I made, very good. But if you do not worship it, you will be thrown immediately into a blazing furnace. Then what God will be able to rescue you from my hand?" Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego replied to the king, "O Nebuchadnezzar, we do not need to defend ourselves before you in this matter. If we are thrown into the blazing furnace, the God we serve is able to save us from it, and he will rescue us from your hand, O king. But even if he does not, we want you to know, O king, that we will not serve your gods or worship the image of gold that you have set up." Now, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were respectful of King Nebuchadnezzar. We don't see them yelling or shouting or screaming or anything else at the king, but they were firm in their commitment to obey God rather than King Nebuchadnezzar. And in return, they were thrown into the fiery furnace. Peter and the apostles faced a similar situation in the book of Acts when the religious leaders told them not to teach about Jesus. But in Acts 5:29 they replied, "We must obey God rather than men." Today, there are many politically correct views that violate God's standards and laws. Are we brave and bold enough to stand up for the truth even when it's unpopular? Because that's exactly what God is calling us to do. Jesus said, "If you acknowledge me before men, I will acknowledge you before my Father who is in heaven. But if you deny me before men, I will deny you before my Father who is in heaven." And then finally, we're going to get out of here early this morning. Finally, as Christians, we need to do what we can to make things better. We need to do what we can to make things better. In Romans 12:18, it says, "If it is possible, as far as it depends on you, live at peace with everyone." Unlike in Jesus' day, we live in a country governed by a democratic republic. We have a voice in what direction our country goes and the laws that are passed by electing and holding accountable our elected officials. In Jesus' day, Caesar did pretty much as he saw fit, and that didn't sit very well with the Jewish people. In fact, many Christians were persecuted and even died in the 60s AD for their faith. Oral tradition, so that's not specifically in the Bible, but what was passed down from father to son, from generation to generation to generation, tells us that every single apostle was martyred, killed for their faith, save only John, the Apostle John, who died in exile on the prison isle of Patmos. Oral tradition says that Paul, the Apostle Paul, was beheaded for his faith, and Peter was crucified upside down because he did not feel worthy to die in the same manner as Jesus, his Lord. By participating in our elections and being actively involved in the legislative process, Christians have the best chance of living peaceful lives here in America. There are three ways that I think that we can do that. First, we must be Christians first and everything else second. I listened to Focus on the Family quite a while back, and I heard Dobson refer to a reporter on Fox News who made the comment that he wished that Christians would just stay out of politics. The implication was that when Christians become involved in politics, that we blur the line between the church and the state. A definite problem as far as this reporter was concerned. Why is it that anyone should be allowed into the arena of politics except Christians? I guarantee you that transgender people are bringing their beliefs into politics. Muslim people are bringing their beliefs into politics. Atheists and agnostics are bringing their beliefs into politics, yet somehow Christianity should have no part in politics. I just don't think it follows. I believe that one of the biggest problems that Christians face today is the compartmentalizing of our faith. What do I mean by that? Well, what I mean is, we all have these different hats that we wear, right? So for me, I have the preacher hat. I have, the EMT firefighter hat. I have the bus driver hat. I have the husband hat, the parent hat. We all have these different hats that we wear. And sometimes we have this tendency to compartmentalize things so that none of those other things contact each other. My brother-in-law, when he was younger, didn't want any of his food to touch. And Bethany was a little bit that way too. But Mike, so much so that, he would eat all of his meat first, then he would put his vegetables on the plate and eat his vegetables, and then he would get the next thing and he didn't even put them all on the plate at the same time. Sometimes we kind of do that same thing with our Christianity. We have our work part of us, we have our church part of us, we have our parenting part of us, and we don't ever let those pieces touch. But in reality, our Christianity should be an umbrella that goes over all of the other pieces of our life. In other words, I'm a Christian first and a husband second. I'm a Christian first and a dad second. I'm a Christian first and then I'm a preacher or a bus driver. Jesus is calling us to be Christians first and everything else second or third or whatever. Secondly, as we attempt to make a difference, to make our community and government better, we need to ask ourselves, what issues would be important to God? What issues would be important to God? Without a doubt, God cares more about some government policies and laws than he does about others. In Matthew 22, verses 20 and 21, I'll go back and just take a brief little bit of that we started with. Then Jesus asked, "Whose image and name are on the coin?" The man answered, "Caesar's." Then Jesus said to them, "Give to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and give to God the things that are God's." God clearly cares about some things, like murder, adultery, fornication, lying, and bearing false witness, all things in the Ten Commandments, more than he does others. Things like taxes, inflation, the price of fuel, and the border. While certain things might be very important to me, how would they rate on God's list of priorities? I'm not saying ignore issues that are important to you, but place the issues that God would find most important first. Would God be more concerned with biblical marriage or with fracking? With human trafficking or green energy? Let's be honest. The only way that you're going to find a candidate that agrees with all the things that you think are important is for you to run for office. Really? I mean, honestly? Because we're all different. And there are things that are important to each of us that are not as important to others. But for God, there are some non-negotiables, and there should be for us too. What are your non-negotiables? Those things that you just won't back down on. What are the qualities and characteristics that make you who you are? And how do they align with the Bible and your Christian faith? And then finally, do what you can politically to make being a Christian easier. Do what you can politically to make being a Christian easier. How do we do that? Well, we do it first of all by voting for godly candidates at every level of government, national, state, and local. Elections have consequences. The last president nominated three Supreme Court justices to the bench. I think it's obvious that had Hillary Clinton been president and made those judicial appointments, the court decisions on Friday would have been very different. But it goes even beyond that. The Attorney General that is selected by the President determines what laws to uphold or to let slide. Like allowing the protesting in front of the justices' homes, which is illegal. Or enforcing immigration law. Cabinet positions determine government policy in many different areas. In areas like government leases on drilling, on fracking, and green energy. Whatever your non-negotiables are will determine how you're going to vote when you choose a congressman, senator, judge, or president. Secondly, we need to let our governmental representatives know when they are thinking about doing things that we disagree with. or go against God's desires. We need to be willing to contact those who represent us and let them know that we feel that those things that they're contemplating doing are unacceptable. And, honestly, by doing that, you have much more of a voice than you think. Because typically, what most often happens is that we sit around and complain about stuff rather than actually doing things to make it better. The bar is full of people who are complaining about what is wrong. Family reunions. All kinds of places are full of people who are willing to complain about what's wrong, but there's a lot less people who are willing to actually do something about it. And so when you actually call your senator or your congressman or your county representative, you actually have more of a voice than you think, because there's not that many people that actually invest the effort to do it. Finally, we need to be unafraid to share with others what is right and what is wrong. Many times a single person can diffuse negative or harmful speech by telling the truth instead of following the crowd. Have you ever noticed how negative talk feeds on itself? Why, that George over there, he just never does anything right. And somebody else will join in there. Yeah, I know. Did you see his shirt the other day? It looked like he was wearing his lunch on it. And somebody else will jump in there, and it just kind of snowballs as it goes. But a lot of times if one person will say, yeah, but George has always been really good to me, it'll a lot of times diffuse the whole thing. Our founding fathers recognized our God-given right in the First Amendment to share with others peacefully, and we believe that to be true. If we do these things, perhaps our government, our society, will be a better place. After all, it is Christianity. It is Jesus who tells us to love our enemies and to do good to those who hate you. It is Christianity that tells us to treat others the way that we want to be treated ourselves, not to just treat people the way that they treat us in return. I believe that if we do our society, our government, and our world God's way, that we'll have the best nation that this side of heaven can offer.